speaking about the effect of investment in health, treating that as a human capital investment. And we had a simple two-period utility function. I'll rewrite it here. S is the probability of surviving through the second period. Beta is the usual discount rate. And then we had the budget constraint, so expected consumption is equal to discounted. Yeah, maybe we can leave one of the doors open so we can get some air in here. X1 plus S, X2 over 1 plus R plus G of H is equal to W1 times 1 minus L1 plus S over 1 plus R times W2 times 1 minus L2. Right? That's what we had. And if we differentiate this with respect to different variables, assuming that S is concave in H is quantity purchased of some health improving activity like number of doctors, drugs, and so on. G is the expenditures. Okay. And a first order condition, now, I didn't write a couple of these down, but I'm going to write them down now. Ux1 is equal to lambda, Ux2 beta, Ux2 is equal to lambda, and we put an S here, S, and over 1 plus R, right? So because we have full annuity insurances, the S's cancel out. We don't have to worry about them. And notice in a special case where beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus R, let's say as an equilibrium condition, the interest rate adjusts to the rate of time preference, simple models of aggregate models of investment, that would be your equilibrium condition. More complicated models, you have to look at the growth rate, but it just, not necessary for us, but it just simplifies what we write down. You see, that implies that Ux1 is the margin utility. This is the margin utility of U in the first period with respect to X1. Now, the utility I wrote them are the same. In general, it may not be the same. And that's going to be equal to beta and 1 over 1 plus R. Since they're equal to each other, that ratio is 1, right? So we just have equals Ux2. So, well-known condition in these circumstances, if interest rates are equal to the utility discount rate, and then usually we say on a certainty that the margin in equilibrium, the margin utility consumption in the first period is equal to margin utility consumption in all other periods. Now that applies even if there's this form of uncertainty if you have full insurance. Okay, so we showed that before, and we can do the same thing with respect to time. So we would get L1 is equal to lambda times W1, right? From this condition here. W1, L1 is the foregone earnings, so from leisure time. And then we would have the same thing for beta S times UL2 is equal to lambda W2S over 1 plus R. And the S drops out. S drops out on both sides. And if beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus R, we get UL2 is equal to W2. So that UL1 in that circumstance over UL2 is simply equal to the ratio of the weight. And we showed all that. All right. I'm not going to use all that, but some of that I'm going to use again. Now, if we differentiate with respect to H, what do we get? We get S prime. Look at our utility function, which I hit up here. S prime, derivative with respect to H, times beta U, and I'm just going to say U2 now, because to designate that it's in the second period, is going to be equal to what? Well, it's going to be equal to lambda times G prime. That's a marginal cost of taking more health, plus a term S prime over 1 plus R times X2 minus W2 times 1 minus L2. And the ones are there because we're assuming L plus W, L plus hours of work, we call that M, is equal to 1. Okay? And H is in goods, not in time. Otherwise, we'd have to modify that. Okay? So, we went through at the end of last time what this was. This is clearly the marginal benefits. The benefits you're picking up from improving your health is the fact that you have a higher probability of getting the utility in the second period. Not the utility, the marginal utility, but the utility. Somebody asked me a question. You asked me that question, didn't you, about what part of the utility is due to health and what part isn't? Maybe it wasn't you. I'll blame it on you, though, okay? I thought it was you. We don't have to make that distinction. It just automatically comes out, it's you. Like in any self-protection problem, you're changing the probability of an event to utility level that you're picking up, not the part due to that kind of activity. That's important to recognize, okay?
Excuse me. Well, now I'm ready.
Oh, maybe you did ask that question, yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, like, I get this setting, and, I mean, I think I've asked the same thing to Professor Murphy, but, I mean, like, he did it in an aggregate setting, so his answer made more sense. But here, let's say that we're in an individual level. So, you would have a problem if, like, X2 is bigger than the amount that you're earning, right? Because you could earn...
Could be.
You could have a problem where the agent, like, dies, and then there's really no one to repay that debt, right?
No, wait a minute. Yeah, I think you're really misunderstanding what we're assuming here. Murphy, believe me, knows the answer to that question. Okay, not such a difficult question.
Yeah.
And it's fundamental. Why isn't that a problem here? I know what you're saying. Yes, it's true. But why isn't it a problem here?
Well, I don't know.
Because they're buying insurance. Think of the person, the beginning of the first period, saying buying insurance, an annuity insurance. You pay a certain amount. And they say, yes, you pay that certain amount, right? And we're going to give you a certain amount in terms of expected wealth over your lifetime that you can spend in either period. If you don't live to the second period, we get it. And if you live to the second period, you're getting more than you paid.
But isn't there a selection problem on the people that died? Because you could effectively, like, borrow a lot from the future, right?
Well,
like,
I mean, it might be, it might be heterogeneity across individuals. And the question is, do you know their probability such that you can offer them fair insurance? I'm assuming you're offering this guy fair insurance. So he may be different than everybody else. But as long as you know what his probabilities are, a competitive market will drive you, and no cost of running this business will drive you in that direction.
All right. So
that's all stuff we did in 301.
Yeah. So you're assuming that you have that framework? Such
I just assume I mean, if I didn't have that framework, then your issues would come up. So you'd have to say, well, how am I constrained, right? Maybe you have a constraint, I can't leave negative debt. So I have to, everything I consume in the first period has to be subject to the fact that I can end up leaving negative debt if I leaving debt if I live through the second period. That might be one constraint, right? That might be a constraint. In this case, the way we have it, if you die at the beginning of the first period, you're leaving an asset to everybody else. You're contributing to their welfare. And if you live, they're contributing to you. The guys who died early are contributing to you. That's the assumption. Seems like a good starting point. It's not necessarily the only way you want to do it. In fact, we just had a dissertation defense yesterday in which he asked, why don't people buy annuities, even though the loading factor is very low? Fact is, nobody much buys it. I mean, we have Social Security and people have other stuff, but there's a lot of non-annuitized wealth that people have, particularly at higher income levels, not so much at the low income levels. They don't buy them. Right? But I mean, I'm not going to go into everything his answer, but his answer, and I think it's the right answer, is that they're leaving bequests to their children. So having their children insure them is a cheaper way of doing it than the 10%. Let's say there's a 10% discount off of fair insurance. And it's cheaper to have your children take care of you if you live longer than to buy that unfair insurance. And he showed under various utility assumptions, you can do it. It's not a big effect on the kids' wealth, what you leave them for the most part, and so on. But whether he's right or not, it doesn't really matter for what we're doing, because we have full annuity insurance. And even in his case, you could buy perfectly fair insurance, everybody would do it. Okay? But good, good question. Anything else? Okay. So tell Professor Murphy I answered the question he couldn't answer. Okay. So this is what we have, and this is our basic condition. And this is the cost side, so this is the marginal cost H, marginal benefit of H. And I think the most interesting part of this, neither of these terms so much, but the fact that marginal benefit depends on utility levels, not on marginal utilities. That's interesting, okay? Now, so from that point of view, you can think, at least in part, as investing in your health as a form of self-protection. You may be we're buying complete annuity insurance. But remember, again, I keep going back to what we did in 301. I think it was in 301, whenever I discussed uncertainty, I don't remember 301 or 302. Remember we said, even if they bought complete insurance, we'd say fair insurance, you still might want to engage in self-protection. But what self-protection does is maximize your expected discounted wealth, and what insurance does is smooth that out in terms of your consumption in different states of the world. So in general, you'll have both, right? And here we have the self-protection component. There's no reason, because we're buying full annuity insurance, that this marginal benefit should be zero, right? Less reason than some of the insurance problems we gave, but it's a very much related problem. All right, so what are people doing? Well, a way to look at that is, we know what lambda is. Lambda is simply marginal utility in period 1, right? With this assumption, marginal utility in period 1 is equal to marginal utility in period 2. So we can replace lambda by U2x. Okay? So have, again, now we're converting everything into monetary units. U2 over U2x is x2, really, and the elasticity of substitution, let's say, over time, or the concavity overall, which we'll show it later on. Anyway, this is what we have here, okay? So, and then we're equal to that cost. That's another way to look at it. Now, there are two reasons. There are two reasons, and this is what I want to show. Maybe Murphy did this as well, but I don't, as far as I don't think he usually goes into this sort of question. Two reasons why we might, as individuals, Murphy did everything you say in the aggregate level, because he was looking at economy-wide effects, which is, and I'll get a little bit into the economy-wide. I'm thinking at the individual level, and then we build up to the economy level. There are two reasons why you may spend on health as an individual in a maximizing. One, that the self-protection reason, that you lower the probability of the bad state, namely dying, and so you have some self-protection. And the second reason that's often more emphasized in the literature on the value of life, say in Rosen's class, I don't know if you read Rosen's classical paper on valuing life risk. Rosen emphasizes is the difference between average and marginal utility, the concavity of the utility function. So forget about lesion now being in the utility function, and U1x over Ux will be a function of the concavity of the utility function. And I'll show you that's true generally what U1 measures in. So if you have a difference between marginal and average utility, then an advantage of lowering the risk of dying is that when you lower the risk of dying, you pick up average utility. When you simply transfer across periods, like with insurance, you just, pension insurance, you're just picking up marginal utilities. You're equating marginal utility. In the simple case, you're equating marginal utilities in the different states, right? But if there's a difference between marginal and average, then by investing more in your health, you pick up the advantages of average utility over marginal utility, or the concavity of the utility function. And I'll show you that very explicitly. Any questions at this point? All right, now, no question? All right, so let's look at this a little bit. Suppose, I want to see what this term looks like. Oh, it's U2 over U2x, okay, but let's make it a little more explicit. Let's make one assumption, that the utility function is homothetic in time and goods of degree gamma. Gamma will be less than 1 or less than equal to 1 in a strong case, right, because of concavity. Right? So basically, okay, so what do we mean? So if we have homothetic utility functions, it means that the property, if the function is homogeneous, let's say homogeneous of degree gamma, then we can write utility in period 2 as equal to 1 over gamma times U2x times x2 plus U2L times L2, right? With constant returns, gamma is 1, and this is simply the usual Euler adding up equation, right? Product of marginal productivities and quantities summed up is equal to the output or utility. When you have homogeneous functions of degree gamma, then you have to adjust for 1 over gamma. Okay? So if gamma, and that's where the difference between marginal and average utility comes in. If gamma is 1/2, then utility is double what you get from the marginal products effects alone. Right? It's twice as big. I'll give you some numbers on that later on. So now, if we look at this thing, divide this by U2x, 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 what do we get? Well, this drops out, so we get equal 1 over gamma times x2 plus L2, write that out here. Now what's this? Well, let's go back. That's why I wrote these equations down. If, let's say, it really does depend upon that assumption, but let's say in general that if we take this condition, we have, let's write it down, let's say beta U2x is equal to lambda over 1 plus r, right? And then we know from L2 that beta UL2 is equal to lambda over 1 plus r times w, right? So lambda over 1 plus r is equal to beta UL2 over W2, or betas cancel out, and that means that U2L over U2X, take x down here and bring this up, is equal to W2. That's general. So the marginal rate of substitution, here, let me put it in words. The marginal rate of substitution between goods and leisure in any period really only depends on the cost of time versus goods in that period. It doesn't depend on any discounting or anything else because you're doing everything within the same period. So that's what you're going to be looking at. Okay? Now why is that interesting? Well, because now we can say we can replace this thing by W2. And so now we have a very neat expression. Do a lot. So we have this very neat expression. What we're saying is that we look now, go back to our condition here, S prime, beta, and then this turns out to be 1 over gamma times x2 plus L2 W2, right? Is going to be equal then G prime okay. So what we have done is say, well, this value, this benefit, we've now converted this benefit into a neat expression, right? Well, because the term in brackets is your full consumption in period 2. To measure your full consumption. Now, we take your actual consumption, we weight your leisure time by the wage rate, so we can add them up. They're all in goods units now, and it's your full consumption. So we say, well, the benefit is just full consumption adjusted for the difference between marginal and average utility. 1 over gamma. I mean, there's beta in there and all, etc. Right? That's what we have. No, I hope I didn't forget the beta. No, the beta's there. Okay? All right. And the cost, well, you didn't do anything on the cost side. Any questions on this? Question? Now, we can rewrite this. Let's take, here we have a W2L2 term over here, S prime, okay? Let's assume that beta, let's go back to our assumption, beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus R. Okay, so I'm going to replace this by 1 over 1 plus R, okay? So now I have S prime over 1 plus R, S prime over 1 plus R. I'm going to bring that to the other side, and I'm going to get on this side S prime over 1 plus R times 1 over gamma minus 1 times X2 plus L2 W2 is equal to what? Is equal to S prime over, no, is equal to S prime over 1 plus R times, well, let me get this right. It's equal to G prime of H plus S prime over 1 plus R minus W2. Okay? That's what the condition turned out to be. All right. Now you say, what does that condition mean? Well, the way to understand what that condition means is the following. Suppose you chose H to simply, not to maximize expected discounted utility, but to maximize expected discounted wealth. So what we're going to maximize, okay, what we're going to maximize is the following. We're going to maximize W, and that's going to be equal to, by definition, full wealth. Let's say W1 over beta S W2 minus G of H. So we're going to choose H to maximize net full wealth. Okay. So if you're simply interested in getting as much expected wealth as possible, not worrying about in terms of utility, that's what you'd be trying to do. And if we do that, what's the first order conditions? Well, first order conditions, let's say we have H. H is our only variable here. W is fixed, W1 and W2 is given. The first order condition is what? It's beta S prime times W2 is equal to G prime of H. Right? And concavity with G double prime negative. Right? That's, remember we mentioned, that would be perfectly good maximization first order condition. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, anybody. Eric, what does it mean?
I mean, so the G prime of H is the marginal cost you pay now. And then,
Well, yeah, you only that's
yeah, I mean, that's
then
what
you have,
that's your
right?
expenditure on goods and health now, and then what you're getting out of that is the chance that you marginal increase in loading.
Well, you get some wealth. I mean, what it means literally, if that's what you're saying, you know, by having a higher probability of living, you pick up the expected gain in the wage rate, right? So that's what you gain. That's your full wage. All right, that's one thing. What it means, yeah. I mean, that's reading off each term and saying what that means. I'm trying to get at something a little deeper than that, and maybe I didn't make myself clear what I mean. Go back to the utility maximizing condition over here, right? Right here. 1 over gamma minus 1. When will that condition be the same as this condition? Remember, beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus r.
When gamma is 1.
When gamma is 1. So that's it. That's an important implication. It really hasn't been recognized that much in the health literature. It's implicit, obviously. What it implies, if gamma equals 1, it implies max V equivalent to max W. And the reason for that is, well, if gamma is equal to 1, its constant returns to scale, it really doesn't matter as long as you can pull more time into the leisure out of the market segment. It really doesn't matter if you consume more in one period or you consume it broken down by a couple of periods, on the assumption that beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus r, which we use to derive it. It doesn't really matter. So if that's the case, might as well just maximize expected wealth. So under those conditions, all you're doing is self-protecting. You're maximizing, I'm calling maximizing expected discounted wealth self-protection. Okay. But we know that's not the whole problem. Okay. Because we assume in general gamma is less than 1, strict concavity. Right? So we have strict concavity, then what do we know? Well, we know that this side here is positive, right? Because 1 over gamma is greater than 1, so that's positive. Okay? And so that would say that G prime H is then greater than S prime over 1 plus R W2, right? Turns out it's right, whatever I wrote down. And what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, Eric, you would say, well, it means that the marginal cost is greater than the discounted value of the wage rate, right? It does mean that. But what does it mean more than that?
I mean, it means you're spending less on health.
But 8G is concave, is convex.
G is convex.
Yeah. Increasing cost of wait a minute. Good question. Let me make sure. Yeah, G is convex. That's the cost, so it's a convex cost function. Absolutely, G is convex. So what does it mean? You're spending more.
You're spending more than
Because you're picking up an additional benefit. You're picking up this difference between marginal and average utility, which is what gamma less than 1 means. You're picking up that extra benefit. Picking up that extra benefit. And so you're going to go further. So the optimization that we see is a combination, with gamma strictly less than 1, is a combination of the self-protection. If gamma is close to 1, that's pretty much all you have. And if gamma is a lot away from 1, and a lot of what you have is the traditional emphasis in the value life literature, the difference between marginal and average utility. Right? The concavity of the utility function. Okay? Everybody follow that? You follow?
Yeah.
Okay. Why is it happening?
Because you have diminishing returns in each period on moving some of your consumption over to another.
On utility, you have diminishing return.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
So what you can get in terms of a better utility stream
Right,
counts for a lot.
exactly.
That counts for a lot. Even though you know your marginal utilities are going to be equal in both periods,
Right.
in equilibrium.
Right.
All right. So, I mean, this may seem, well, this is just a lot of formal, nonsense. But it's interesting. It tells you what you're really getting in your theory of the optimal investment in health, which is the theory that I think is very relevant, because I stressed right at the beginning of the analysis of the health area, the personal input into health is important. Sure, we're all born with genetic genetic structures, is the word I'm looking for, which predisposes you toward various healthiness or diseases. And there's no doubt people differ enormously in that. But in addition to that, people can do a lot to affect their health. And as I said, in the modern world, they can do more and more. Do you smoke or not? Probably very few people in this room smoke. The educated people don't smoke. In pretty much all countries, not all. It used to be true the educated people smoked more than others because they were wealthier. And like everything else, smoking was a superior good. Now the educated people smoke less. Good question, why? Partly this reason here, that's in a way of investing in their health, and we'll see that their lives are more valuable. Now you say that, politician will see red, but all that we're saying is from their calculation, it's more valuable. What you want to do in public policy may be another story, although you won't ignore that in public policy either, let me say, but we're not saying that. All right, so politicians can relax in all this. You can be politically correct and still say this, that people see themselves as more valuable. They have more utility. It's utility levels that are important. They have more utility. That's crucial in the value of life literature. Okay, to recognize that. I'm going to use that topic. But there's a lot of personal input. And I think that's really important. That's really important. There's a lot of personal. I mentioned smoking. I could mention 100,000 other things that we all do. And I mentioned a lot of them before, and they're worth repeating. What kind of diet do I have? Do I exercise or not? Do I drink, heavily? Or do I not drink at all? Do I, when I have a symptom, do I know what my symptoms are? Do I go to a doctor quickly? Let's say it's a certain type of cancer symptom. But if I go quickly, I can get control over it. Do I go quickly or not? You can go on and on with things that people have to do. There's nobody there who's telling you do this, you do that, you do that. We're free individuals. That's the great value for free society. But it also means, what you do is dependent upon what you do. You have to make those type of decisions. So they're very important in the modern world. And that therefore an individual maximization problem, even though there's genetics, and even though there's medicine, and the state of medical knowledge, and there's drugs and so on, what the individual does, given all that, that's an RG function. Given all that is still very important. Okay, now, you're...
So since utility levels matter so much, how do we think about the cardinality of utility? We know that any linear transformation, for instance, or any monotonic transformation is also a utility function.
It is. It is. It's true. Now, how do we think about it in this particular context? The monotonic transformation will be on the V function. First of all, you got to remember, not on the U function. But it may mean that once you take a monotonic transformation, you're not in some additive utility framework. That's the way you have to think about it. So then, when you look at your first order conditions, you have to look at what those first order conditions are in maybe a non-additive utility function. Remember, you're not taking the monotonic transformation on the U, you're taking it on V. And that's crucial. Okay. So we're dealing with a particular form of that, but we're putting it mainly in monetary units, namely full income. The only property of the utility function, we say, well, we're going to estimate an additively separable utility function. I've assumed among the class of utility functions that explaining people's behavior is an additively separable utility function. And we're going to estimate, therefore, a parameter, the gamma of that additively separable. That's the only parameter we need to know if we assume that also there exists a homothetic. Among that infinite class, there exists a homothetic. So it's perfectly legitimate what we're doing. Now, does it challenge what gamma is? And I'm not going to say a lot about that, but that is a parameter that's been used in a number of studies. Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Another way to put it, let me put it a way some of you may like. If you have gamma is equal to 1, all you have to do is estimate full consumption. That's doable. It would be great. I mean, from an analytical point of view, that'd be great. Estimate the wage rate. You measure the value of leisure time by the wage rate. Perfectly legitimate in that case, fully legitimate. Add it to consumption because you have it. You're home. You have everything in monetary units. The problem is, if gamma is less than 1, what you have is, what I said the difference from marginal average utility. Another way to say it is you have consumer surplus. That's where this consumer surplus comes from. So you also have to have a way of measuring the consumer surplus. Now economists have ways of trying to measure it. I put it in a particular form here. You may measure it by some area under some demand function, H, for example, as you change the cost of H and so on. All right? So in addition to the full income, the fact that your time and goods in utility terms is more than, maybe greater than these marginal values. That's consumer surplus. Okay? All right. So now let me go into, unless there are questions, more explicitly into what's called the statistical value of life. There have been many studies that have been trying to measure, in a sense, what we're getting at. How much are people willing to pay to avoid certain risks? Or how much are people, do they have to get paid to make them willing to take on various risks? So for example, the classical study started with looking at jobs. Some jobs were risky, you could die on the job, and others were not. How much more, if anything, did the people who were taking the risky jobs get paid compared to those who were taking the less risky jobs? So if you knew what the difference in risk, you can tease out from that, and assuming you have to worry about the selectivity, that people taking the risky jobs may be less concerned about risk than others. So it's not as simple an econometric problem as I'm saying. Assuming you can do that, the first studies didn't try to do anything much on that. Assuming more recent studies, of course, try to do that. But even whatever there is, you may get a biased estimate. But what you're estimating when you estimate, even if you just look at that difference, is some measure what the marginal person is willing to pay in order to take on this greater risk of dying, and so that's a monetary value. So let's say if the greater risk of dying is 1/10,000 in period 2, it's a very small additional risk. In our problem, how much would you be willing have to be paid to take on a 1/10,000 additional risk? Well, we have that from our first order conditions. We would say, well, what they have to be paid is if we change S prime to by 1/10,000, how much more would we have to change the right-hand side in order to measure how much they have to be paid to be compensated for that? It's one way you can think about that. Or an indirect utility function where probability of dying enters in, how much more wealth do they have to compensate? That's a better way. I like to think of it in terms of the indirect utility function of wealth, maybe prices, and probabilities of survival. How much higher wealth makes you just as well off with a little bit higher probability, right? So we get that out of it should come out of some maximization problem. You can get just out of a utility function, but the utility is adjusted to equilibrium, so it really comes out of your maximization. And the sort of estimate in the literature you find is for if the increase in the risk is 1/10,000 per year. Now, we have only one additional year, but suppose it was lifetime, you'd have to be paid an additional $5 million. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is right, but I didn't say it right. So what I'm saying is wrong, at least. I mean, when people say what I'm saying, I'm right, I know what I'm writing, but I'm just not writing it right. I usually say you don't know what you're writing. If you know what you're writing, you usually get it right. So I didn't get it right. So let me go back and say what's going on. Let's say the risk is they're going to increase their risk by 1/10,000th in each year. How much do they have to be paid each year? And the answer is that is around $500. Now, from some studies, they find $300 or $200, others find $700 or so on. But if you take $500, divided by the change in the probability equal 1 over 1/10,000, that's equal to $5 million, right? So it's like taking S prime, changing it by 1/10,000, dividing it by this term on the right, and let's say the numerator is $500, and that divided by the inverse of 1/10,000 is $5 million. So if you look at, that's what how people get what they talk about when they say we're talking about the statistical value of life. I mean, the notation I'm going to use for that is V is equal to SVL, and that's, let's say, anywhere from 3 to, let's say, 7 million in U.S. And not for everybody in the U.S., for the typical person in the U.S. So a lot of qualifications you have to make. There's not a single number. A poor person will pay less, will have a lower value than a rich person. Why? Well, if they had the same utility function, the same gammas, then their full income is lower. So if my full income is half your full income, and my gamma is the same, then basically I'm going to be willing to spend approximately half of what you're willing to spend. Right? So my value of life, yours is 5, mine would be 2.5. So when we go to a poor country, well, the value of life in India is 1/6 of that in the United States. Now some people complain, well, wait a minute. You're saying people in India aren't worth as much as people in the United States? Well, it depends on what metric you're using. I mean, if you ask, is the government of India willing to spend as much to reduce the probability of a road accident, a death from a road accident, as the government of the United States? The answer would be clearly no. Just travel in India, and you can see that. The roads are terrible. Invitations to accident. So poor countries are willing to pay less. They recognize this. It's obvious because, instead of getting all upset and on one's high horse, think of the following. I'm a government. I have limited resources. How much do I want to put into reducing the probability of dying, put into education, put into some other form of activity? And the Indian government has limited resources, so they're going to put less into this. So they recognize this. Now, whether they recognize it proportionally or not, you can argue about that. In some sense, I'll show you some evidence they recognize it in a sense more than proportionally. Not less than proportionally, more. But they recognize it. So, I mean, it's just an aspect of reality that the individual has to recognize and the society has to recognize. You're not talking about ethical worths of different individuals. You're not talking about that. And you may say we should try to equalize expenditures on health for a variety of reasons. That's fine. But if you ask, what's the value that people are going to place on this? What's the value that society places on it? That's going to vary with individual incomes and with incomes of a country. And it does vary. It's not just that. a theoretical implication. It does vary. You see it all the time. So the amount that U.S. spends on health is a lot different than the amount that, say, Nigeria spends on health, or Pakistan, or India, or China, or Brazil. That doesn't mean we have the highest life expectancy in the world. And that's a good question. Maybe we'll get into that. But there's a clear, strong relationship between expenditures on health and per capita income in a country. Right? Both private expenditures and public expenditures. Okay. Any questions?
Empirically, how does the value of life change for the person as you increase the probability of death?
Well, we don't have a lot of good estimates on big changes in the probability of let's say, if you look for the United States,
Yeah.
you can say, and I'm glad you asked this question, you can distinguish various concepts. You can say, given what what our S is, what are we willing to pay for the small variations around S? But another question you can ask is, given the same S, what am I willing to spend if my option is S goes to 0? To avoid S going to 0. So let's say I'm faced with a major disease, and if I spent enough resources of my own, I can, let's say, eliminate that risk of that disease, at least for a while. Suppose that was true. How much am I willing to spend to do it? All right, well, the same analysis is relevant, but now you have to think of this not as a marginal change in S, but some integral over all these marginal changes, right? And it may be that integral is going to have it's going to be all your will. You can't spend more than you have, right? So your upper limit is your will. So let me put it in the context here. Phillipson, Murphy, and I have a paper on exactly this problem. People at older ages, how much are people willing to spend for modest improvements in their life expectancy? Let's say they can take a drug that can increase their life expectancy by 6 months. How much is that worth to them? Say they're 85 and they have a disease, they have a cancer. The new drug just came out for prostate cancer, a vaccine. It's a revolution, I think. But what it does so far, as far as they can estimate, it, on the average increases these for people with serious prostate cancer, everything else doesn't work, and it increases their life expectancy on the average in their sample group by 4 months. It costs $100,000 a year to take that drug. Are people willing to spend it? All right? So some people say, well, what's 4 months? I mean, on the other hand, if it's 4 months or nothing, and you're not leaving money to anybody, a lot of people say, well, let me throw everything, I mean, more or less in it. At least leave something for me to consume, but throw everything in. Then I'm willing to spend a lot. So it can vary with the type of risk you're facing. And to the extent that your willingness to pay, and we would expect that from this analysis more or less, the extent that your willingness to pay varies as S varies. It will be a function of S, particularly if you think of percentage changes in S. In this analysis it doesn't, but in percentage change in S, and it will vary. So we conclude that people may be willing to pay a lot for just small extensions in their life expectancy. And one reason is about it. Even if they had heirs, they might be willing to pay a lot. But we get it out of this type of statistical value of life, but it has to be more sophisticated. So it's a good question, important question. It hasn't really been answered in the literature very effectively. Any other questions? Yes?
Empirically, willing to take a risk is the same as willing to avoid a risk?
Well, for small changes, they have continuity. Yeah, it should be the same, right? So we haven't said, S prime could be positive, S prime could be negative, and the first order conditions are the same. For big change, of course, it could make a difference, right? It could make a big difference from, let's say my probability of surviving if I don't do anything is 0.8, and if I do a lot, it becomes 0.95, and I don't do anything might be 0.65. Those may not have the same values. I mean, it's like any function, you know, depends. Maybe one presumption might be that the avoidance maybe has a bigger value, but it's a little tricky, but it may not in general have the same value, right? Marginally, if this analysis is right, and it's continuity and all this, it should have the same value, but in general, it need not have the same value. Okay? You see why? I mean, it's in any problem. How much am I willing to pay for a cucumber? Well, let's say I just bought 3 cucumbers and they, what, 50 cents a cucumber? I don't know what they sell for. Let's say they were good cucumbers. 50 cents a cucumber. You go to Whole Foods, so you're going to pay a lot. And then you say, but, okay, this is, how much am I willing to pay for 10 cucumbers? Doesn't mean I'm willing to pay 50 cents each for the additional 7, right? That's what we say is a negatively inclined demand function. You're willing to pay less as you go on. Your marginal utility is declining. Well, something very similar is going on here. Okay? Only it's not cucumbers, it's, you know, life years or something like that. Anything else? Yes.
Why the government spends more in trying to protect less accidents in the roads, but not try to protect people from killing themselves,
Well, what do you mean from killing themselves?
from committing suicide?
Well,
Because-
we do. We have laws against helping people commit suicide.
Yes, but
Because there's some things you can't, I mean, look, you should be able to answer your own question.
I mean,
We have had laws, they're not against people taking their lives. I think most of those laws have gone now. But we have had laws, and you can assist people. And people have been sent to prison for assisting people. But they take the individual. How's the government going to do it? I mean, there's some things you can do more easily, and some things you can't do more easily. How's it going to do it? Now, what we have is you can have somebody committed, somebody who's suicidal, and a relative says this person is suicidal, they can be forcibly committed to a mental institution. Now, the laws have made it much harder and harder to do that, I think in recognition of the fact that, you know, individuals should have a lot of rights to say what they're doing, and committing people against their will, you know, maybe in cases that's justified, but you got to be very cautious in using that power. Because it can be, and it has been greatly abused at times. So there's certain things you can't affect very much.
but for example, if you...
And for people, let me go on. People who want to commit suicide, we'd say their statistical value of life is 0 or negative.
Yeah, but the people who drive more risky, they have a lower statistical value of life.
They-
Of drug-
they
of
do.
driving drunk.
They do, but it may be, all right, let's answer your question. Good question, but there's an answer to it. Every good question has a good answer, should have a good answer. Sometimes we don't know what it is, but it should have a good answer. All right, what's a good answer to your question?
That is suicide. The people who kill themselves, they have lower, even lower than people who drive.
Let's say I'm driving, no, not that, that may be true. I'm driving recklessly. I'm affecting everybody else. I'm affecting everybody. The externality issue is important. Remember we dealt with that one, I think I mentioned that with the drunk driving issue. I'm affecting everybody else. Yes, there's an interest in limiting the recklessness of individual driving. Now, if we had a tort system where you could be forced to fully compensate the person, we wouldn't do it. But that's, if, you know, you're killing somebody's life, and that's the 0-1 situation, they may be putting all their wealth on. You don't have that wealth. What's called judgment proof. So we have other ways. We send you to prison. We do other restraints on it. Maybe build a better road, preventive. That's why we do it. Okay? Anything else? All right. So what do I want to do? So basically, the way I think about it, the discounted value of life. So here, we go to V. Where do we go to V? That's that's going to be basically on this 1 year basis. It's going to be now. If we had a whole series of years, so then we'd be summing this. Let's say we had n periods. So we extend the utility function of n periods, and you can take an action. I'm going to do that a little bit later on. Let me hold that for a moment. And you have to think of it over a number of years. Because if I improve, think of this. This is a very, the demography of life expectancy has this interesting fundamental complementarity. If I take an action that raises my probability of surviving next year, it also raises my unconditional probability of surviving the following year, and the following year, and the following year. Doesn't necessarily affect the conditional probability once I reach it, but the unconditional probability is affected. And it's the unconditional probabilities that enter into the analysis, not the conditional probabilities. All right. I'll show you that more explicitly. But it should be clear because cap S, let's say the conditional probability is a little s, and the unconditional cap S is cap S. So if I had 3 periods, I'll show you. This is important. So here's our utility function up there. Okay. Now I have 3 periods. All right, so B is going to be equal to, I'll do this exactly everything. Let's call that you can go on and on. Beta, what we know. What is S2? S2 is, as of the present, what's my probability of surviving through the second period? S3 is, as of the present, what's my probability of surviving through the third period? These are unconditional probabilities. Right. Now, you can write S3 as equal S2 times little s2 times little s3. Where little s2 is the conditional probability of surviving in the second period, given that I reach the second period. Well, in this example, everybody reaches the second period, but it may not be. And s3 is, given that I've reached the third period, what's my probability of surviving through the third period? And capital S3 is the product of those two things. Okay. And that's a complementarity type property. And so we'll use that to gain some insights, right? But not yet. Okay, we've done that. All right. Yeah, this is worth doing. Now, I said 5 million, let's say, is in central Tennessee. Is that a reasonable number? Well, for the United States, for the typical person. How are we going to know that? Well, let me give you a back-of-the-envelope type of calculation that shows you. Well, it seems like a lot of money. It's pretty reasonable. So you take it. This is only for young people. I'll come back to that issue. We take a young person. Make the following calculation. Say the typical income in the United States is $40,000, approximately. Annual income. Now, in the early literature, really very early literature on the value of life, like there was a famous book written by an actuary, Alfred Botko, who really did important work in fundamental theory of demography, what's called these steady state theorems on age distribution. But he wrote a book, The Money Value of Man. And he just looked at discounted earnings. We don't want to do that. We want to look at full income. Well, so we have to add the amount spent in the household. Well, how much? Well, we know 40 hours a week is spent in the marketplace, and what, 128 hours a week is left over, right? 168 hours a week, so 128 hours a week, but you know, a lot of that we would call maintenance maybe, like sleeping, personal care. So I take like 1.8 times the hours at work and multiply that. So that means I would add to this 40,000, 1.8 times that for the value of the household time. So what's 1.8 times 40,000? That's 72,000, I think, right? So plus 72,000 for L, okay? This is earnings, so it's WM. This is L. And I get like 100, let's say 110,000. It's 112,000, 110,000. That's my annual value. That's a lot of money. Now, you think of 40,000, how am I ever going to get to 5 million? But I don't have 40,000. I have 110,000. Now discount 110,000 at no, not quite yet. Not quite yet. I was going to say, but there's a step before the discounting. What's the step before the discounting? Pardon me?
Growing. A growing rate.
Grow it?
Yes, because your earnings are going to grow.
Yeah, okay, yeah, maybe. Well, let's think of it as staying stagnant. No, it could be. It could be grown. Okay, so you grow that up. But that's not what I'm thinking about. But you could be. I mean, it makes some sense. It could be growing over time. If you had a, you know, depending on what the growth rate is. But what, in our analysis, haven't I captured? Gamma. So, you know, I have to, this is full, what I have now is full income, full consumption, approximately. But I have to then multiply that times 1 over gamma. So in the study, there's a paper written by Philipson, myself, and Rodrigo Suarez. And what we use for, we use some international comparisons of full income, taking account of life expectancy and then comparing equality and so on. We use gamma equal, based on the literature, gamma equal to 1/2. And so, I mean, that is a figure that is not fully pinned down by any means. Let's say gamma equal to 1/2. Right? So 1 over gamma is 2. So times 1 over gamma equal to 2 times this, that gives 220,000. So this is the full income. Now we have, this is a measure of the utility each year, 220,000. So now we're talking about, you know, real money. But that's going to be discounted. So this is going to be, this is an annual gain. So let's discount that at 4%. So we have to multiply that times 25, right? Roughly, for this is like for perpetuity, people living a long time, and it's roughly, you have to multiply that times 1 over r. 1 over r is 4%, it's 25. Right? So now we take 1 over r, 1 over little r, that's equal to 25. We times all that, and then we get times 25 and we get, what? What do we get? That's right. 5 million? 50, well, roughly $5 million. Right? 200,000. 200,000. Yeah, 200,000 times 25 would be 5 million. So roughly $5 million. So we're getting up there to the right numbers. Now, of course, these are rough calculations. Gamma may not be a half. Interest rate maybe it's 5% rather than 4%. So but still, you can get a number in the right ballpark. So this back of the envelope calculation is very useful. It convinces a skeptic that these numbers make a lot of sense. 3, 4, I'm not saying it says 5 million, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 even. Those are right ranges. So when Murphy does this aggregate stuff, which was very interesting, you know, it really doesn't matter so much what the individual value of life would be, because you're multiplying by all the people in every age. It makes a difference. It's going to be a huge number. Instead of using 5 million, use 3 million or 2 million. It's still going to be in the trillions, tens of trillions. Okay? But at the individual level, it makes a difference. And it makes a difference at the aggregate level. I mean, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Because everything you're going to multiply up. So I'm using 2.5 rather than 5. Everything is sort of cut in half in his numbers as well as these. Okay? But so this shows that convinced me when I was trying to ask myself, well, are these reasonable numbers? And I said, yeah, you know, they're pretty reasonable if you think about it. Yeah.
The statistical value of life is how much society values a person's life?
No. No, it's how much the individual values their life. That may be related to what society values. But this is all based on the individual. This all comes out of individual maximization. Now, to the extent that society's values are reflecting individual values in some kind of utilitarian view of what society does, yes, then it would also reflect society's values. But it's not directly reflecting society's values.
If we were to calculate society's values, would leisure still be counted as?
I didn't hear.
If we were to calculate the societal value of a statistical life, would leisure still be included?
Would what be?
Would the value of leisure still be included, or like household?
Well, why not?
Well,
Should society value less the time you have fun in the household rather than the goods you're eating? Why shouldn't it count?
I don't know. I mean, if you measure like production as sort of like what
But
society.
this household production. Household production. That's the main part of the game in economics. Household production. I'm only kidding about that, but it's an important component of what is in right. You shouldn't just look at what's in the marketplace. I mean, that's what we're trying to get away from. Just looking at what's in the marketplace. If we just look in the marketplace, we look at X. But why ignore people's leisure? Why ignore people's leisure? All right? Suppose people have mainly leisure and little X. So should we give them little weight?
So if we separated out leisure and household production,
Pardon me?
if we separated out leisure from household production, we still think we should include leisure?
Well, it depends on what you. If you could measure the household commodities, then that would be fine. But they would include in them the time inputs. So they're just different ways of measuring the same thing. You can measure national income accounts from the sum up all the outputs, all the goods consumed, all consumer goods, investment goods. Or you can sum up all the value of all the inputs. And those should give you the same answer. So you can't double count. You don't want to count the output and then also count the inputs. That's double counting. But you can do it either way. Since we don't have good measures of outputs for a lot of household production, we look at inputs. Okay? Anything else? Yes.
Self-protection, according to our model, is important when you have another period, so you can increase the probability of surviving the experience. So if you have several periods ahead, you should have more incentive for self-protection. But
We would. You know, the longer the discounted value of what we're doing, if we're taking a set of actions that affects our probability of surviving not only next period, but several periods, then that's going to be greater than just what the one period effect would be, assuming the one period effects are comparable. Yes, that would be greater. So younger people will put a higher value on their life than older people.
But we see that, I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but you see more young people taking risks than older people. Older people shouldn't take much
Well,
more risks.
it depends what, I mean, older people have a lot of risks thrown up to them. Younger people have to seek out the risk. I mean, older people have diseases and so on. They're facing a lot of risk. It says they're not facing risk. How much should I spend as an individual on various forms of medical treatment? Should I go for preventive checkups? I mean, you know, should I have this procedure and that procedure? Should I have myself checked for this, that? These are all risks. So they just have different risks. But nobody can say that older people have fewer risks. When it comes to this area, they have more risks.
But they should be, I mean, you're saying that, I mean, not accounting for the risks they have, but for the attitude toward risk. It seems
Well,
to me
they have an attitude. I don't know how their attitudes toward risk compared to younger people. If you mean in terms of the preferences, I mean, you want to separate out behavior from preferences and prices and incomes, okay? I don't know if their preferences are different. They may look as if they're taking fewer risks, let's say, in their investments. That doesn't mean their preference toward risk is any different. They're in a very different situation. Let's say I'm a younger person taking risky investments. They'll average, as partly insurance, over a 30-year period, they'll average out their return, so the variance in the 30-year return discounted may not be so big. While I'm an older person, my stock market portfolio goes down. Maybe that's just a bad break, but you know, I don't have that many more years, and I have to worry about that. So you can understand their behavior toward risk as being different. Doesn't mean their preference toward risk is different. Okay, those are different issues. Yes.
How do we think about whether people value children or having children in this framework?
Okay, good question. This is a general issue is what determines their values. In my calculation, I was able to get a value of 4 to 5 million without putting any emphasis on the value, the fact that you value being able to see your spouse and your children, your grandchildren, and all that. That should, if anything, only make the numbers higher, right? Our framework doesn't capture that because all I'm looking at is my own consumption and my own leisure. I could easily capture that, put in other people's consumption. So let's say my X is not simply my own consumption, but it's my children's consumption. And then I have it. So in principle, I can incorporate it. The way I did this sort of back of the envelope calculation, I didn't incorporate it. And that means I'm being conservative and underestimating what we can get, which is generally it's better to err on the conservative side when you're trying to say that the number is kind of reasonable. Okay. All right, so last couple of things I want to say today. So you take a country like India, whose income is 1/6 of the United States, and approximately speaking, let's say they had the same gamma, their value of life should be like 1/6 of the United States. If it's 5 million in the United States, it should be like 800,000 in India. Okay? Not negligible for a young person, but still a lot less. So in terms of what they will do, they're not going to be willing to spend as much as somebody in the United States is willing to spend. And they don't. Neither the individual or the government. Come back to your government. Either the individual or the government. Okay? And they don't spend it. Okay? You can see it in what they spend on medical care, what they spend on roads or other factors that can affect this. In fact, if you look at the ratio of health spending to GDP, that rises with economic development. Richer countries spend not only a larger amount, but a larger fraction. Right. So let's say we spend 15% or so on medical care. India might spend maybe 6%. So they're showing evidence that they're not willing to put as much resources into it. It makes a lot of sense. Doesn't mean everything is exact, but it makes a lot of sense. Okay? Well, you think about this, and I'll discuss it next time. Suppose, we just had a swine flu scare. Government ended up grossly overestimating the likelihood of such a pandemic. But we'll show reasons why it's rational to err on the side of caution in these things. And the question you think about for class on Tuesday is, well, what would be the cost of a pandemic similar to the flu pandemic that occurred in 1918, 1919? Look up some numbers on that, and I'll test you on Tuesday, and then try to give a value for the world. Tell me, what would be your estimate of what the cost to the world would be of a pandemic equal in magnitude to 1918, 1919 flu pandemic, which was the greatest pandemic, not in history, there were worse ones, but in the last century and three-quarters or whatever. Okay? And then answer the question, how much are we willing to pay to try to avoid that? Okay? So that will be your assignment for Tuesday.